Hey, and welcome to another video from our Diversity and Inclusion short input series. My name is Nina Kiel and I'm the head of Diversity and Inclusion at Flying Sheep Studios in Cologne. So in case you've missed the introductory talk on why you should care about diversity and inclusion, please make sure to check it out first. You'll find the link in the description below. So today we're going to cover some terminology that will likely be used in conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it's really important that you familiarize yourself with it, both to be able to join these conversations and to better understand these short inputs as well. Now, the first three terms were actually covered in the introductory talk already, but it might be useful to recap. So let's do that. Diversity is any trait or dimension that can be used to differentiate people and groups of people from one another. There are many of these traits, including, but definitely not limited to, gender, race and ethnicity, age, religion, social class, or disability. And in terms of representation, for example, in games, diversity means including a variety of characters and also stories in an attempt to at least partly represent the actual diversity of the world. Next up is inclusion. Inclusion is the maintenance of an environment that welcomes, respects, and supports the participation of all individuals or groups of individuals with their differences, and especially those who are disadvantaged and have suffered discrimination in one form or another. And behind this concept is the idea that everyone should be able to use the same facilities, take part in the same activities, and shape the world. Equality means being equal in status, rights, and opportunities. And it also refers to the practice of allocating the same resources and also opportunities to all people. Equity, on the other hand, recognizes that each person has different circumstances, and because of that, it allocates the resources and opportunities that are needed to reach an equal outcome. So there's a big difference between those two, even though they are often used interchangeably. Another term you might hear very often in discussions around diversity and inclusion is intersectionality. The term was coined by a feminist scholar and lawyer called Kimberlé Crenshaw as early as the 80s, but it's been more in use today. It's an analytical framework that describes the interconnected nature of social categorizations like, for example, race, class, or gender. And importantly, it acknowledges that systems of discrimination or disadvantage are not separate from each other, but they can actually overlap and create entirely different experiences of discrimination. So, for instance, the everyday experiences of a Japanese woman can differ widely from the experiences of a Japanese man or a white woman. And that's because sexism and racism combined create new challenges for those people who are affected by them. And that's just one example. The overlap of disability and race, or class and religion, for example, can lead to different kinds of discrimination experiences as well. Next is a term that has been heavily used and heavily misunderstood in recent years, because woke is used often in a very negative way to describe certain ideologies that influence people and their lives, and usually ideologies connected to diversity in some way. But actually, woke only means being aware, especially of social problems such as racism and inequality. It's an adjective that is derived from African American vernacular English, and only as recently as the 2010s, it came to encompass a broader awareness of social inequalities and has also been used as a shorthand for identity politics and social justice. Gender and sex. Gender and sex are often used interchangeably, just like equity and equality, but they are in fact two very different concepts. So gender describes socially constructed roles, behaviors, expressions, and identities. And it has absolutely nothing to do with the body, except that certain norms and expectations are linked to certain bodies because of social constructs. So, for instance, women are expected to be good at care work. They are expected to become wives and mothers because allegedly they're inherently good at it. But this is actually a gender role or a social expectation. Women are not inherently good or better at household keeping or at raising children because they have, for example, ovaries. In German, we call gender soziales Geschlecht, or social gender, if you will, which highlights the social dimension of this concept. As opposed to that, we have sex, which refers to the biological and physiological characteristics of an individual. So, for example, reproductive organs, chromosomes, hormones, and more. The sex is determined or assigned at birth based on these characteristics, but it's actually also very complex because, again, sex encompasses a variety of traits which I just listed, and the list was not exhaustive. So it's actually not that easy to determine and to fit people neatly into two boxes. That's very important to keep in mind. Now, speaking of boxes that people fit or don't fit into, let's talk about the words cis and trans, or cisgender and transgender. Cisgender is a term that is used for someone whose gender identity matches with what they have been assigned at birth. So someone who was assigned male at birth and who identifies as a man is considered to be cis. On the other hand, trans or transgender describes someone whose gender identity does not correspond with what they have been assigned at birth. More specifically, a woman who was assigned male at birth but actually identifies as a woman is a trans woman. And a person who was assigned female at birth but actually identifies as a man is a trans man. I'd like to point out, though, that the term transgender does not only refer to binary gender identities, meaning male and female. It actually also includes people like me who call themselves non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, or agender. Now, these people may identify with more than one gender, a separate third gender, they have a fluid gender identity, or they reject the concept of gender altogether. But they have in common that they don't fit into the binary gender system. The next term, or rather acronym, is probably something that you are already familiar with because it's widely used in general in society. It's LGBTQIA+. The acronym stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, and sometimes there's an A and or a plus or asterisk added to mark space for other kinds of gender and sexual identities, for example, agender, asexual, and also others. Now, this acronym has changed quite a bit over time because it was slowly expanded to account for communities which had previously been less visible, and especially intersexual people or intergender people who are born with any of several sex characteristics, including chromosome patterns or genitals, or who do not fit typical binary notions of female or male bodies. Another acronym that is less widely known, especially because it's used in German-speaking countries and mostly in queer feminist communities, is FLINTA. FLINTA stands for Frauen, Lesben, intergeschlechtlich, nicht-binär, trans und agender. And again, the asterisk at the end indicates that other non-binary gender identities are included as well. The term has its origins in the women's shelter movement, which originally only addressed cis women. But then in the 90s, discussions started around the concept and whether it should be open for other people who are also affected by patriarchal structures and discrimination, so it was expanded on. Now, these discussions are still ongoing and actually even more pressing today because trans women in particular are heavily targeted by individuals, organizations, and legislation in an attempt to exclude them not only from women's spaces but many areas of public life, which is something we will talk about in a future presentation. Now, this issue brings us to the next term, which is TERF. TERF stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists, and it's pretty much self-explanatory because it refers to feminist activists who don't believe that trans women should be considered women and hence shouldn't enter women's spaces like the aforementioned shelters, but also restrooms, fitting rooms, saunas, or women's sports. In these discussions, trans women are framed as having either an unfair advantage in sports or as predators who only dress up as women to infiltrate spaces and harass cis women, which is entirely false, and will address these misconceptions in a future talk, which I just mentioned. Now, some trans exclusionary radical feminists also actively advocate against trans women's rights in general, like the right to receive proper health care, for example, through hormone therapy. And at the same time, trans men are often framed by these trans exclusionary radical feminists as victims of an ideology or a trend rather than individuals with agency, which is not particularly feminist, as I would say. Now, this is a very simplified summary of an incredibly complex issue, but again, there will be an entire talk focusing solely on that. So let's continue for now with the next term, which is queer. Now, queer used to be actually a pejorative term which referred to people with non-heterosexual desires and relationships. They were cast as the outsiders, as the others. But in the 1980s, it has actually been reclaimed by activists and communities and is now very widely used as a neutral or even positively connotated umbrella term for people who are not heterosexual or cisgender. The next acronyms are POC and BIPOC or BIPOC. These stand for People of Color and Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. Now, both terms are used to describe any person who is not considered white. And they also refer to experiences of systemic racism, which these groups may share, despite their different cultural backgrounds. It's widely used by POC themselves, not only to describe societal and cultural issues, but also to create a sense of community. But others kind of see it as problematic, and there's been some criticism around these concepts and these words because they group together people of great ethnic diversity and different experiences and identities. So there's discussion around that. If you'd like to know more, I will happily share some resources about it. The next term I'd like to cover is neurodiversity. Neurodiversity refers to diversity in the human brain and cognition. So, for instance, in sociability, in learning, attention, mood, but also other mental functions. Neurodiversity provides a very inclusive view of cognitive diversity because it highlights the differences at a neurobiological level while also considering the socio-cultural context of a human's lived experience. People whose brains differ in mental or neurological function from what is considered typical or normal are called neurodivergent. It's a term that's frequently used with reference to autistic spectrum disorders, but also encompasses other types of cognitive variations. By contrast, the term neurotypical refers to people whose brains function in a way that is commonly expected or perhaps framed by society as normal. Now, these two concepts will also be explored further in a short input about neurodiversity at the workplace, so make sure to check that one out. Finally, I'd like to introduce you to a concept that's really helpful to know about to avoid making mistakes, especially when creating media products and games. And that is tokenism. Tokenism is the practice of only making a symbolic effort to be inclusive, especially by recruiting or over-highlighting people from underrepresented groups. And this is not only, but very often done for publicity purposes. So for example, when a company creates marketing material that features photos of employees, and these photos heavily focus on people who belong to or seem to belong to minority groups. And this is done specifically to make the company appear more diverse and inclusive. And the same basic principle applies to tokenism in the media. Here it means adding one or maybe several minority characters to make a product look more diverse and inclusive. But these characters are often just barely defined secondary or background characters and not integral to the story. They are not refined. So in essence, tokenism can be defined as superficial diversity. And in the process, complex identities, whether they are actual employees or fictional characters, are reduced to quotas and bullet points on a checklist. And that's not a good approach, no matter if you're managing a company or a product. And people, both potential employees and consumers, will notice that. I can guarantee that. So if you want to make your company more diverse and inclusive, do it properly. And if you'd like to learn more about how to approach this challenge, feel free to continue watching these talks and check out the sources I'm going to link below. Thank you so much.